Yes.
I'm bored. What should I do?
Well, if you're bored, the lawn needs cut.
I don't want to do that. I want to do something fun.
I don't know.
Robin!
I'm right here. What? I don't know, Brian. I mean, there's like this whole Stormcast Eternal army of mine that you still need to paint.
Mm-hmm.
Brian, I don't care what you do. Just please leave me alone. Like, I don't know. You did just buy that whole big box of Space Marines and like tree-looking guys, right?
Robin!
What? What?
What if Tony Stark were a space marine?
That's your idea. 40k Avengers?
Avengers, assemble! Greetings, and welcome back to Mediocre Minis. Now we finally get started. We're finally going to paint something, and we're going to be painting the Avengers as if they were space marines. For this series, I'm going to be starting off with the original 6 Avengers from the MCU, beginning with Iron Man. Iron Man. Iron Man. Iron. Iron. Whatever, I'm from Pittsburgh. So, with Iron Man, we're going to be starting off with a nice base coat, and then adding on additional highlights, and both red and gold, and also a little bit of blue to symbolize his arc reactor. So, let's get this started. Okay, so here are the colors that I'll be using for the base coating. Before I begin painting on the miniature, here it is already primed and it has a white zenithal highlight. If you're curious as to how I did this, see the video in the top right hand corner. I first begin all the base coating by blocking in all of the red. Since that's the predominant color on Iron Man, I decided to begin with that. At this stage of the game, if you get a little bit of the red or any of the other colors over top of an area you don't want painted, that's okay. You're able to go back and correct it without too many problems later on. This is especially true if you get any paint on the base. You'll be painting and maybe putting materials on the base later on, so it's not too much of a problem. You'll see here I go back and doing a little bit of touch-up work. Some of the Reaper paints, while they are relatively thinner, I definitely enjoy using them as I don't have to worry about paint consistency too much. However, sometimes you need to go back and do some touch-up. I begin the gold paint here. However, I do end up changing because I feel that this gold is way too bright, and I choose a darker shade and I go over top of that later on. And here's where I decided that the gold was way too bright to begin with, so I use a different shade, again by Reaper, to cover that up and to give it a much darker type of sheen. Putting gold over top of other colors can sometimes be a little bit problematic, so you might need to do 2, maybe even 3 layers of paint over top of the red, as you see here with the gold. And here we have the completed base coat for the red and the gold on Iron Man. Afterwards, I move on to doing some of the black trim work, and I use Abaddon Black by Citadel. Abaddon, Abaddon Black, I'm not really sure which one it really is, but frankly I don't mind either which way. Afterwards, I use some scale color, leather brown, to paint in some of the bags and the holster that you have here for Iron Man. I do always try to be as careful and as close as possible, not because I don't mind doing or making corrections later on, but it's also to help with brush control and making things neater. And here you have, I added some additional black for some of the shading, and the gold and the brown are now complete. Finally, the last base coat I'll be using is a blue for what will be the arc reactors. There's a small amount on his chest and the hourglass that he is carrying. I always like to feel that less is more in some situations, so I only use small amounts of blue for the arc reactor. I also put a little bit of the blue on top of some engravings on the sword. Now it's a bit of a mess right now, but I'll be going back over that later on and covering up all the excess. I'll be doing that here with some gunmetal. This is actually an airbrush paint, but I decide that it's okay, though focus is also okay. With a little bit of work, you can get around all of the individual letters, and what you see here is the completed sword and blue. With all the base coating complete, I move on to shading. Now I use the Nun oil over the entire miniature, excluding the gold. I use a different shade for that, but it's good to cover the entire miniature or wherever you want it to be shaded. If it looks much darker than you want it to, that's okay. We'll be going back with highlights later on and making those adjustments to bring the red back out to where we want it. Using washes can be a potentially messy process. You can end up with some shade and pooling up in different areas, but it's okay. You can use a damp but clean but damp brush to remove some of the wash from where you don't want it, almost like it's sucking it up like a straw. Wash takes a long time to dry, but here it is all covering the red. And I use the earth shade for all of the gold trim. This includes the sash as well as around the hourglass. And with that, it's time to move on to highlights! Many of the highlight colors are relatively similar in some fashion, but they are just a lighter shade. I also end up using a little bit of white later on to make the tones even lighter, so I can use that for additional highlights. What I like to do sometimes is get all of the colors that I need all laid out on my palette beforehand. So for here, with the red, I have my original base coat red, I have a blood red, and then also the white from Reaper, so I don't have to stop and open up any of the pots again and dump more out. With highlighting, you're easily able to cover up all of the shaded areas that you don't want shaded, for instance some of the raised edges on his cloak. But it's important to keep in mind that you do not go all the way and cover up everything, because then you'll be covering up the shade, which means you kind of wasted your time and you have to go back and do it all over again. It is possible if I were to start with a much darker shade of red, I wouldn't have to do the wash step. I can simply move straight into the highlighting, which is an option, but I don't tend to use that too often because I like to use a wash whenever I can because it's a lot easier, and for me it's a little bit cleaner because then I have a little bit more control over exactly what gets shaded and what does not. But to each their own. Each method does work. And here is the red, all reapplied my original base coat, with some of the darker areas still left on the cloak to show where some of the shading would be. To go on my next step of highlights, I take some of the blood red and I mix it with the magma red, and this gives me a shade that's somewhat in between both of the colors. And when I apply it, I make sure I apply to a smaller area than I did before, because if you fully cover up the previous coat, well then you kind of, again, wasted a little bit of time in a step. So it's smaller and smaller areas you cover with paint with each time you do a highlight. And the same here on the shoulder pad, covering just a little bit less of an area than I did before. Add a little bit more of the magma red, or blood red, I'm sorry, into the magma red to get even a lighter shade, and this will be used as a now third highlight. One of the nice things with paint is you can always go back and go over something again. So if I found this to be a little bit too bright, I could have easily just went back over it with a darker shade and then reapplied it whichever way I wished. but again, it's also important to always make each highlight smaller and smaller as to transition the color up further and further. Finally, I use a little bit more of the blood red and getting some of the highest points, such as all the creases and edges and trim of the cloak, to give a strongest level of highlight and more of a reflection. Here we have completed all of the red highlights on the suit for Iron Man. You can go as far as you want. I could have applied 2 or maybe even 3 more over top of this if you wanted to push the contrast even further. However, I decided to stop with just those right there. And the same process applies when doing the arc reactor, well, the blue for the arc reactors. Slowly more and more and more, mixing both of the blues together to get in shade within 2, and then I progress from there. This can get very difficult, especially if you're only using a wider brush, or if you actually have a very small area, such as the skull on his chest. You end up putting very, very tiny amounts of paint on, even up to a point where I'm just applying dots. Again, you can do this as many times as you want. You can add actually optional effects to have a blue haze appearing around the hourglass in this, and that blue haze would reflect on his cloak and some of the metals, but I decided not to do that here. And this is what we end up with. I forgot to add on any of the fabric for the purity seal, so I go ahead and I do that now. Now here we have a completed, shaded, and highlighted Iron Man. One last step that you can do if you so desire is called edge highlighting. And this is when you take even a brighter highlight than what you used before and go around specific edges and kind of to help them stand out from other areas. This is used generally with the side of your brush along the very, very edge of any type of model. I predominantly do it on the cloak, and it's very easy to add on way too much paint, but after some practice you can get it relatively easily completed. Then I take some silver and I do a light dry brush over top of the sword. This is to give the sword much more characteristic and doesn't look like one solid blade. Dry brushing is when you take some paint, put it on an old brush, because you can actually damage your brushes this way, rub most of it off, and then apply it to the miniature. I ended up getting some silver on part of Iron Man's armor, so I decided instead of going back and fixing the highlights, I would just add some silver scratches all over the armor, as if it were battle damage or any types of issues that he had. Now, for the head of Iron Man, we're going to be doing something a little bit different. While the Indomitus box comes with a large variety of very interesting and really cool looking Space Marine helmets, I decided to pick something different, so I went through my box of bits and found some Stormcast Eternal heads that we'll be using instead of the Space Marine ones. Yes?
Wait, are you painting my sword? Oh, I don't know if you knew, but Stormcast Eternal helmets, that's not a Space Marine helmet. Are you okay?
Yeah, but the Stormcast Eternal heads are much cooler, and it would work with Iron Man pretty well.
I mean, if that's what you want to do, but I'm pretty sure that Stormcast Eternals and Space Marines aren't in the same universe.
I know, but I just don't care.
Alright, it's your comment section. I'm not policing it.
Well, gonna get flack for something someday. Might as well be for this. For the head, since I decided to paint this separately, I go through the same pinning process that I did with some of the previous Marines that I built, which you can find in the first video of the series. The hanger works very, very well in this situation, and I was able to get a nice sized hole in the bottom of the head very quickly. after some quick tests, I decide I want a little bit deeper, so I go ahead a little bit more, add a very small amount of super glue onto the end of my paper clip, and attach the head and let it dry. And of course, to make it a little bit easier to hold, I put the pin into the end of a cork. Now, as you can tell, this really isn't paint or primed at this time, so I take some of my black primer and I just paint it on with a brush. You can do this step earlier and use the airbrush to cover it, but I also wanted to show that it is possible. If you want to paint on primer, you can do that without any problems. It just takes a little bit more time. And after drying, the head is now fully primed and ready to go for some paint. The process of painting the head is very, very similar to the rest of the miniature. I start with some base coats. I do use the same base coat colors on the head as I did on the rest of the figure. Unless you want it to stand out, you definitely want to make sure you're consistent with the paints and the colors that you use. I like to do eyes a little bit earlier on in the process because if I have any mistakes, I can easily go back over top of them with some of the base coat. Other painters wait until the end, but I'm not that steady with a hand and I don't do eyes very well, so I actually have to do them earlier on. But you can do eyes whenever you wish. Now here I am just touching up all the mistakes I made while applying the eyes. Now I will admit at this point coming up I actually have some issues with the film, but I can show you the beginning of the basing process all the same. Normally I would like to do this before I attach and prime the miniatures, but I decided to wait to the end because I forgot to do it earlier essentially. And the battery died and memory card was full, so I was not able to capture some of the remaining basing footage, but it's just simply applying tufts with some super glue. There we have it. Iron Man is completed. Let's zoom on in and get some of those sweet glamour shots. So, I hope you liked this video. Finally get into some painting, and now we're going to be starting off the Avengers. If you found this video interesting, fun, or a little bit different, please feel free to give it a like and subscribe to the channel. We're going to be moving off the rest of the original 6 Avengers coming up next. Also, if you're curious about how I did things, want a little more explanation, or if you want to complain to me about using a different head, feel free to leave a comment below. I'd like to hear from you and see what you think. Now with Iron Man completed, we'll move on to the next Avenger as part of the series. And I'm thinking between Thor and Captain America. But I'm feeling pretty free, so I think we might have to go with Cap. And with that, this has been Mediocre Minis, and I shall return.